Okay. All right. Hi everyone, it's Ayda Shabanz and thank you so much for joining us today. As you can see, I'm super excited and grateful. I've got our guest here today, which is Antonia Mercorella, the CEO of the REIQ. So just a quick background on the REIQ. It is the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, which is the state's peak professional association for all real estate practitioners across the state. So the association's purpose is to make important contributions to the government policy direction, industry research and development, tailored educational programs, and training and promotion of our industry standards. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us. I know how busy you are today and the last week in around everything that's been happening. So super grateful for taking the time out to speak to us.
You're most welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So first of all, I just wanted to say for anyone that is a owner of real estate in Queensland, this is for you. We've done this to specifically get through to some details about what has been proposed. So the conversation we're going to have today is around the Palaszczuk Government's new proposal that is supposed to be for tenants and landlords. To start with, I just wanted to say, if you could kind of just explain briefly what the proposal is and what's being put forward.
Sure, happy to do so. So as you've quite rightly mentioned, it is a package that is designed to give protection to both tenants and owners in a rental tenancy relationship during the period of COVID-19. Of course, all of your viewers would be familiar with the fact that the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, on the 29th of March, he did announce that he wanted to introduce across all states and territories an eviction moratorium to prevent tenants from being evicted due to financial distress caused by COVID-19, and to allow tenants who had been financially impacted to give them the opportunity to negotiate a rent reduction. So the framework, the proposed framework that our state has announced, that the Palaszczuk Government has announced, that is what it is. It is in connection with the Prime Minister's statement. However, our concern is that we feel that the framework here in Queensland goes far beyond what was originally intended, and we believe that it is a far more onerous framework than that which has been implemented in other states. So let me just explain what I mean by that. So what is being proposed and what has been announced by our Housing and Public Works Minister is that there is initially a 6-month eviction moratorium. That part we're clear on and we agree with. However, what this proposal does is it says that if you are financially impacted by COVID-19, you can negotiate a rent reduction, and that rent reduction, once negotiated, becomes the new rent payable, and that the landlord will not be able to recover the unpaid portion of the rent in future. And that's one of our key concerns. We believe that that is quite different to what the federal government has announced, and we also believe it is unique and that there is no other state or territory in our country that is suggesting that it is a permanent rental reduction rather than a deferral. So that's probably our key concern. We also have some concerns regarding entry requirements to a tenanted property. As you can imagine, the government is trying to ensure that people aren't coming in and out of tenanted properties, which is completely understandable at this time when safety and health is our #1 priority. But what we are concerned about is that some of those restrictions are too tight, and that we're concerned that certain activities won't be able to continue. So what government appears to be saying is that a tenant can't deny entry if it's for an emergency repair, but effectively they can deny entry for anything else. And so the sorts of activities that we're concerned about include things like being able to go into a rented property or a rental property in order to, for instance, continue or maintain obligations that relate to safety switches and smoke alarms and the like. Those are tenant safety related issues, and they're obligations that, of course, landlords have. And also further to that, we're concerned that potentially what's been announced will effectively prevent sales from being affected. Because, of course, if you can't bring a prospective purchaser through that property, it will be exceedingly difficult to sell it. There may be, you know, a very rare exception to that where someone is prepared to buy the property without physically inspecting it. But as you can imagine, that would be an exceptional case. And so, of course, we don't want to see the sale of property coming to a grinding halt. We have said from day one that we absolutely agree that certain protocols and hygiene and safety measures need to be followed. And we have been advocating for only one person being allowed to come into that property with the agent, really limiting those numbers, but that ultimately the tenant should be required to let people like that in very limited circumstances. And then finally, I guess we've also got some concerns around the what seems to be an extension of the moratorium. So and what I mean by that is, of course, our Prime Minister had suggested 6 months. What our state government has proposed is that irrespective of whether you are or aren't impacted by COVID-19, if your tenancy agreement comes to an end, is due to come to an end during that 6-month freeze, it's proposed that that tenancy agreement would be extended automatically at the tenant's election, if they wish, for a further 6 months. And of course, our concern with that is that that would mean that effectively, if you've negotiated a reduced rent, and that becomes the new rent level, and then you are required to extend it, effectively, the landlord is being asked to accept reduced rent for up to 12 months, which is concerning for probably fairly obvious reasons. And then just finally, we're also concerned that there is an additional protection available here that's being proposed in Queensland, which is that the tenant can ultimately end the tenancy and break the lease if they give 7 days, a week's notice. And of course, in any other context, if you break a lease, you would have to continue to pay the rent for the balance of the term. And what's being proposed is that you would only have to pay 1 week's rent. Now, just on that, there is a suggestion that the idea is that it would be limited to people who are in extreme financial distress. But our position on that is that if there are these range of other protections available, we don't quite understand why there needs to be that additional protection available that ultimately allows the tenant to break the lease, in addition to the various other protections that they have. So that's really a summary of what we're concerned about. I might just, as a final point, I do want to highlight though, because I just think it's really important that we make it clear that the REIQ is very much supportive of the key principle of the moratorium. So we absolutely believe that a 6-month eviction moratorium is appropriate, and we absolutely believe and support the need for tenants to negotiate reduced rent if they're financially impacted. So those elements we agree with. It's the additional measures that concern us.
Yeah, so that's a really good summary for anyone that isn't aware of what's happening. I'm trying to understand how come just for the state of Queensland, why is it such a vast difference between what's been actually, you know, as a nation being said, this is what needs to happen, and when you're comparing state to state, why is Queensland come up so harshly on, you know, and been a little bit in, you know, I'm a landlord, I also have a lot of clients that are landlords, and I also rent property. So from both sides, I feel like, why is it so, I feel it's a little bit more biased towards tenants, and there's no transparency available to owners. You know, I agree, if you are going through hardship, then there should be help. But one of my biggest concerns was that they said that you don't need to provide any evidence of hardship. Now, from what I can see, and what I've already seen from a business point of view in other areas, is there are people that would take advantage of that system. So what's the thought process, and who who do they actually speak to before they put these proposals in place? You know?
These are all excellent questions. They're the questions that we have also. I can't answer that. Look, I think I will say this. Obviously, we are in uncharted territory. This is an event that is unprecedented. Decisions are being made very quickly. Having said that, it's disappointing that they came out with this announcement. I don't know why our state has decided to take such a unique position on this issue. I think if we're honest about it, the government wants to ensure that it's protecting tenants, and the minister has said he doesn't want to see tenants amassing debt. And that's very honourable, and at one level I comprehend it, but you can't just come out and say, I don't want one party to amass debt, but I'm happy to have another party, namely the landlord, then have a debt at their end, which is effectively, if we're honest, what will happen. It's transferring the debt from one party to another party. So that's the issue we have with that. I will say that we need to be sensible. We recognise that there will be some tenants who will be able to pay back if we introduce deferred rent, which is what we're advocating for, there will be some tenants who will be in a position to pay back the rent eventually when things go back to normal. And of course, there will be some tenants, I'm not saying that magically when this is all over, tenants will wake up and suddenly have a bucket of money available to them and they can pay it back. So there will be some tenants, particularly those who are perhaps the most vulnerable in our community, who may not ever be in a position to pay it back. And our view on that is that those people need to be protected, but they need to be protected by the state government, not by private citizens, not by private mum and dad investors. So that's the issue we have with that. I guess the other concern I have is that the government seems to have adopted this very blanket approach where they've decided tenants won't be able to pay it back, so let's just say it's a permanent waiver. Well, with all due respect, I don't think that's appropriate for the government to come along and take that sort of an approach. I think I will acknowledge there will be some who will not be able to pay it back. And so let's deal with those people in a way that caters for them specifically, rather than saying all tenants across the board won't need to repay rent. We just think that's too extreme. And just to finish on that topic, you've quite rightly mentioned that in other jurisdictions, let's compare it to New South Wales. There it's very clear that it's a rent deferral. What's interesting is that if you compare the median rent, say even just between those states, Queensland and New South Wales, you can appreciate that rent is much cheaper here in Queensland. So the median weekly rent in Queensland in 2018-19 was $360 per week for a 3-bedder and $355 for a 2-bedder. And so when you consider that median, and then you consider that at a federal level, the various stimulus packages and financial relief, it's all one standard amount of money across all jurisdictions because it's a federal package. And then, of course, the state has also, various states have supplemented through other state-based packages also. But you do have to scratch your head a little bit and say, well, on average, we're paying less rent than they are, say, in New South Wales, and yet in New South Wales you have the ability to defer it rather than waive it. So it is a little bit of a mystery why they've decided to go down this unique path.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other part of that is that when I was commenting about the ability not to show, like that they don't have to prove that they're under hardship, like that blew my mind. Because we own a rent roll, and as an owner of properties, I thought, well, right now, if as an agency, we do income testing. So I 100% agree with you about how Queensland's rent is already so low based on income to debt ratio of the household. And we also do income testing to say 30% of that rent should be their income. So most people should already be able to cover that 30% ratio. But if you go on TV and announce you no longer have to pay rent, why would people pay rent? So I think that I 100% agree with you. Based on that point, are you proposing the same ruling as the New South Wales percentage of the rent drop or rent reduction? If you could just explain that.
Yeah, so our position is that, we've got to be careful that it doesn't, and just to be really clear here, I'm not making a broad statement about tenant conduct at all, but we have to be realistic. There will be a portion of the tenant community who may see this as an opportunity, and if they're not required to provide evidence of their financial hardship, then it is open to exploitation. Yeah. I'm not saying that every tenant will do that, but there will be some who may attempt to exploit it. And so we think that the 25% threshold that New South Wales has adopted is fair. I know that some commentators believe that's too low and it should be higher. But again, I think, we want to be fairly reasonable here and balanced. So 25% as New South Wales has adopted would be something we'd be happy with. And I think what we need to remember is that so the department has clarified now that you can ask to see a statement like a Centrelink document or a separation certificate. But the issue we have with limiting it to those documents is that those documents don't tell you much. What they prove is that someone has been terminated. A separation certificate proves to me they've been terminated. A Centrelink document proves to me that they're on Centrelink benefits, for example. But that doesn't get us far enough, because, of course, if we're being asked, if the minister is saying, I want parties, tenants and owners, to sit together and negotiate in good faith, which, by the way, that's what the REIQ wants too, to do that exercise and in a meaningful way and in a way that allows the landlord to make an informed decision, you have to have an understanding of how their income has been impacted. Because a separation certificate says they've lost some income that was related to their job, but that's all it tells us. There might be other income, for instance, and to suggest that it's a breach of privacy or an intrusion, I've got two points to make about why I don't think that's a valid justification. Number one, we have to be realistic here and understand that this is a contract between two parties, and one party, the tenant, is requesting a reduction in rent and therefore is seeking a variation to that contract. Yep. And in those circumstances, it is reasonable and it is fair that the landlord should say, show me why I should agree to that. So that's part one. And of course, part two, which is perhaps even more relevant, is that the tenant has already shared, as you would understand, the tenant has already shared a lot of their financial information, either with the property manager or with the owner, if the owner is self-represented. Because, of course, when you apply for a rental property, one of the key exercises that needs to be conducted in terms of due diligence before you give that property, approve that tenant, is that you want to be satisfied that they have the capacity to meet the rental obligations, and therefore you will ask for a range of financial information that establishes what their financial position is. So in actual fact, that information has been shared at some point in time at the beginning of that tenancy or pre that tenancy, and really all we're saying now is prove that your circumstances have changed. And we're not saying prove it because we just want to be sticky beaks. We're saying prove it so that I can be sure that A, there's a legitimate need, and B, we can come to a reasonable decision about what that rent should reduce to based on that information. And so we think that's entirely reasonable. And even though I want to acknowledge that there's been a shift in terms of saying that certain documents can be requested and provided, we don't think that goes far enough. We think it needs to be, access to the documents you need to be able to make an informed and proper decision.
Yeah, 100%. So based on all of some of the topics we've spoken about, what I want to know is, what are the chances of what they've put forward actually going through, and what can we do, and how can we make sure, as you know, including everyone you know, that's listening to this, and as a community of owners, how can we make sure that what's put forward is fair?
Sure. Well, of course, we launched a campaign, Everyone Matters, on Tuesday evening this week, and that's gone absolutely gangbusters. It's such a simple grassroots campaign. It really just is nothing. We kicked it off with a simple little 30-minute video, and that's gone viral. It's ended up, I think it's reached about 300,000 people. It's crazy in such a short amount of time. So I think that speaks volumes about how concerned people are. And we know that the Premier has received hundreds and thousands of letters from concerned citizens, property owners, and just concerned citizens.
Yeah.
So look, my view is I'm still optimistic that we can affect change. We're not saying we need to start again. We're not saying no to the moratorium. We're saying yes to a number of the key aspects. We're just saying that it goes too far and it needs to be pared back. And so I'm confident that we will get a better outcome, and I'm confident that we will end up in further discussions and that we can affect change. And fingers crossed, we will get all the requests that we have asked for. But of course, there's always some negotiations to be had in these exercises. But what I would say to you is that if people are watching this and they're concerned by what they're hearing, it's really easy to have your voice be heard. We would encourage them to watch our video on the REIQ Facebook page. It's only 30 minutes. And it describes the proposed framework in a lot more detail. So I would encourage people to watch that video and to share it with as many people as they can. And they'll find that on the REIQ Facebook page. So that's easy to do. And then secondly, if you do feel concerned and you want to let the Premier know that you'd like change before next Wednesday, because that's when Parliament sits and proposes to pass this, then the thing you need to do, which will only take a minute or two, is go to our website, REIQ/Everyone Matters /, and on there you will find a letter to the Premier, and it outlines the changes that we are seeking, and people just need to click on that letter, open it. If you're happy with its contents, then send it as is, email it to her on the email address we've already included in that letter. If people wish to add to that letter or amend it, of course, they're at liberty to do so. And it's as simple as that, a simple activity like that. And we know that it is having an impact. We know that just yesterday afternoon, we saw that there's some signs that they're prepared to speak, and that there's room for negotiation. And so we still feel really confident of a positive outcome, and but every single voice matters, and we really need everyone involved in this campaign so that we can get the change. And the window of opportunity, this is what I guess I really want to stress, is that the window of opportunity is very, very limited. Unless we act really swiftly, it will be too late, because Wednesday is D-Day.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pop some of those links down in the below description where people can follow the link and just jump on straight away. So right. I will talk about that. Just before we finish up, I wanted to just touch on the insurers. I know that there's been a lot of talk around the landlord insurance not paying out on policies where tenants aren't paying rent. Are you lobbying, or is there anything that the REIQ has been able to do around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. We feel quite, you can imagine there's a huge level of outrage from landlords who have been paying their premiums for many, many years, and they feel really let down. So it looks like there's still, certainly based on the terms of policies, if once you negotiate and mutually agree to a rent reduction, it's pretty clear on our reading that you won't be able to rely on that policy. And that's one of the reasons we're asking for a rent deferral. So certainly if we can get the rent deferral, then obviously it's deferred rent. You don't need to rely on that policy. But what we're saying is we think the policy should respond if you're being forced to negotiate rent down. But of course, policies aren't constructed in that way. I mean, you know, they don't contemplate a scenario like this. So we have had some discussions with some people about the insurance issue. It's a difficult issue to tackle because obviously insurance companies aren't renowned for finding reasons to pay out policies. And look, to be fair as well, it's you know, it's such a the scale of it is so enormous that obviously insurance companies are scrambling to see what they should do. And you would be aware that we've seen a number of them pulling out and no longer offering policies. So yes, look, some discussions are happening behind the scenes. It's always a challenge for us in terms of which battle we fight and when and how hard and what we focus on. So if I'm honest about it, our focus has been more on making sure we can get a framework that's fair and reasonable for landlords so that they don't have to actually rely on that policy. So that's really our key priority at this stage. But obviously, insurance-related issues and bank-related issues are very much also part of this discussion.
Yeah, on the bank issue, what I found strange was where they've talked about the extension of 6 months on any lease. But if they put this in place and then they say the automatic extension, but the government's only providing the 6 months interest freeze or deferral to owners of property, it feels like everything's not in line. Everything is not in line.
And that's the problem with us going in a different direction in Queensland only, because you're quite right. We've made that point. Banks, and even then, I wouldn't say that there's complete consistency on banks offering deferrals. We did see the Big Four come out with a consistent statement when it came to business loans, but I wouldn't say we've got consistency in this space for investors in particular. And we do know that some banks are offering deferrals, but you can appreciate that there's not a consistent approach. And I know of many owners who have reached out to their banks for a deferral, and they're still waiting after weeks for an answer. But you're right, the banks have, I guess, been, even those that offer one, generally they're offering somewhere between 3 months to 6 months. I don't know of any that are offering 12 months. And of course, they're not ready for that because it's not consistent with what the federal government had announced. And so that's also part of the challenge.
Well, yeah, so we have a finance company and we're dealing with a lot of those inquiries from our investors. And I mean, some people haven't even been able to get through yet on the lines, let alone apply for that. So that leads me to the next part, which is what I wanted to pick your brains on real quick, is to ask you about what you think the cause and effect will be around this. So all of this happens, it all gets put in place. What do you see happening in terms of the actual market in the future with all of these current changes?
I always want to be careful when answering these questions. I don't like to sound hysterical and predict, doom and gloom. That's not helpful. But equally, it would be somewhat Pollyanna-like to suggest it won't have any impact. So my view is that this will have, if this framework passes in its current form, it will massively impact future investment in Queensland. It will smash confidence, and it will send a number of investors over the edge. There's no doubt in my mind, we all know that there are property investors out there who really make some tough sacrifices and they're barely hanging on by a thread in terms of the ability to retain that property. And all the financial commitments that are associated with it. So it will be the straw that breaks the back for some investors. So that's I don't think there's any real dispute about that. Others, it will just hurt them. There will be some financial hurt there. I think we will see some people being forced to sell, and they'll probably be forced to sell at lower prices than they would normally accept. So that will impact on value. And I think overall, just when you consider, I mean, even outside of just this one residential tenancies framework issue, COVID-19 on the whole will have an impact on the market, because we know that confidence is key when it comes to property. You know, our decisions, whether we're buying an investment or whether we're buying our new home, we need to be confident when we make big decisions like that. We need to have confidence that we have the money to service that mortgage, that our jobs are secure, that the market won't crash. And I think for some time after COVID-19, our confidence will be at a low. And then this, on top of that, obviously will exacerbate that. And so I'm really concerned about that. And I do think that we'll also see, I think we'll see it having an impact on the appeal of being a property investor in the future. I think there'll be many out there right now, and we're already seeing it and hearing it, where people are saying, I have no intention of ever buying a property again, because they are terrified at the prospect of, you know, of this, well, if the government does this today, what's to say that it's not going to do it again in the future? And, you know, and I think that fear extends past just this issue, if we're honest. I think all of us will, when we eventually come out of this post-COVID-19, I think there'll always be, for some time anyway, that fear that will hover over all of us. Is this our new, you know, will there be something else like this again in the future? And I don't think any of us know the answer to that question. So I think all of that's going to have an impact. And of course, you know, the reality is that the market's going to obviously not continue as it has been. I know that sounds like a very obvious statement. Yeah. So we already know that the market is starting to slow, that fewer people are putting their properties on the market. So of course listings will come down during this period. That's inevitable, and it's just the byproduct of this pandemic. But I think also in this, specifically in this tenanted property space or investor space, I can imagine that property investors are going to be really reconsidering whether they want to stay. You know, I see that a portion of property investors will eventually, when we come out of this, make a decision to simply sell and either not invest again in property or potentially not invest again for some time. And that's concerning for a number of reasons. Because obviously it concerns us given who we are and what we're about. But I think it's concerning because we have a very strong demand for property for tenants. Our tenant community here in Queensland is enormous. 35% of Queenslanders rent, and that rental demand is growing. So that's concerning, that we won't have sufficient housing available to provide to that growing tenant community. And of course, then at a broader level, I think we all understand that property is the backbone of our local economy, not just in Queensland, I might add, across all states and territories. Of course, we rely so heavily on stamp duty revenue to fund a multitude of services and infrastructure, which of course all Queenslanders gain benefits from. And so it is concerning to understand how that revenue will be replaced in the short to medium term. So I think anybody who thinks that, oh, well, it doesn't matter to me because I don't own property, I think that's not right. There's different impacts. Obviously, for a property investor, there's far more direct, immediate impacts. But I think for all of us, there will be an impact, and it won't be a positive impact, obviously.
100%. So I think that's a really important message. Property is the backbone of Australia. We are currently seeing shortages of property in terms of new stock being put into the market. Our population is continuing to grow. So we really need to get behind the REIQ. For anyone that is listening, as you've heard, it is super, super important that everybody takes a couple of minutes to download. We've got the links, add your name, send the email off, because it will affect anybody. So if you're not a landlord, you heard Antonia say it's going to affect you in the greater perspective. So we need to make sure that fairness is provided to everyone. And I just really, again, I know you need to run. So I just wanted to say thank you so much. You made such amazing points there, and I'm very grateful for your time. I think you're doing an amazing job. We're all behind you. I've been watching you for some time. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your support, and let's keep fighting to get a more positive outcome for everyone.
100%. Thank you.
Thank you.